Well, I think one of the places that the criminology and criminal justice, which terms used to be considered doing different things, are now very much the same. It doesn't seem to make much difference. I think one of the places and areas they should go into more deeply is international comparisons. I've become particularly and keenly aware of making these comparisons, not just because I've spent some time in Israel and Italy and England, but primarily now because of China. It was nearly a dozen years convinces me that there's so much that we don't know, not only about China as a culture and as a literature and as a history, but in our own special fields of criminology. There's so much that we need to look at and for international comparisons. That is one area in particular that I would like to see stressed. Criminology and criminal justice programs have blossomed all over this country, as you know. We have, and the American Society of Criminology now has about over 2,000 persons who attend. When I was president, we were lucky to get 200.
I remember those meetings. I remember when we didn't have a quorum for voting.
Yeah, that's right. So that it has grown, and grown in ways that I've been very pleased to see. Again, I would stress that along with the international comparisons and learning more about crime, for example, in South Africa and what little we know now about Russia and organized crime, along with the development of theory. The idea of doing a study of criminal homicides came not from even Thorsten, but from a former professor I knew, and suggested that there needs to be some more systematic empirical work done on it. I contacted the homicide squad and got permission from them to go over their files for a 5-year period. And so that's what I did, and covered and read the elaborate files on 588 homicides. But more than that, and it took me several years to do that, usually because I was teaching full-time. As an instructor in those days, you were teaching anywhere from 10 to 12 hours a week, which was twice what we teach now. And so most of my reading and data collection occurred in the evenings, anywhere from 8 o'clock until 2 a.m. More than that, though, I wanted to get a more observable impression of the homicide squad and the work that they did. So for 3 years, I rode around with them, not every week, but commonly on Friday and Saturday evenings, the period of the highest homicide rates. I got to know their work. I came to appreciate them very much. I respected them. They didn't function in an efficient way just because I was present, because I became part of the woodwork, and they forgot all about my being there. And so I respected the way they handled even in those days, which was early days. I didn't see one instance of police brutality. And we became, at that time, there were only 28 members of the homicide squad, and nearly double now, I think. I became close to all of them, and when I finished my work, I held a party for them. All 28 of them came. we had champagne and celebrated. And so I decided to engage in some theory, and that's how Subculture of Violence was born. I came to believe that many of the people who engage in physical violence and that become criminals do so out of a system of values where the ready resort to the use of violence and physical aggression is a common phenomenon. We grow up with it that children as infants are given physical discipline more than psychological deprivation of love or anything of that sort. The child sees the husband and wife or the persons who were their biological reasons for being alive, see them fighting and domestic violence. They go out into the schools and there's violence, the street and there's violence. And so that violence becomes a way of life in which there is no sense of guilt about using physical violence. Moreover, they often, therefore, engage in aggression and get into arguments, which many people in the parent culture, in the middle class culture, view as trivial reasons for getting into an argument. Get into arguments with people who also come from the subculture of violence.
In the 1960s, you began your work with Thorsten on constructing an index of delinquency, the Celine Wolfgang Index. It's so well explained in your book, The Measurement of Delinquency. Can you tell us a bit about how the index was developed and the original way in which it was used?
Well, originally, Thorsten and I wanted to do something about criminal statistics. Thorsten Celine had been writing about criminal statistics, and even at the time, shortly after the FBI was formed and the Uniform Crime Reports was initiated. So he was deeply involved in that from the very beginning, and so he taught me. We applied to the Ford Foundation for funds, and the Ford Foundation at that time was the criminal section was directed by Jackson Tobey, a colleague of yours.
Of course.
And he was interested in supporting us, but we had to get the word delinquency in somewhere. So the book is called The Measurement of Delinquency, but there's very little concern with delinquency as such. It's the measurement of crime. And Thorsten and I were both aware, and I try to tell my students the same thing, that the way the FBI now counts crimes means that every crime is given a score of 1, and they're all treated the same. Whereas, particularly in the case of robbery, the people you simply have a robbery, maybe an armed robbery, but that's about it. And yet, we all know that a person can be threatened without any injury, or he can be seriously injured. The victim can be seriously injured and sent to the hospital. A whole variety of amounts of money can be taken, from $10 to $1,000. And sometimes robbery is intimidation is with a weapon, and sometimes not. These are differences in degree of seriousness, and that's what we wanted to capture. And that's why we went to the public, first approximately 1,000 people in Philadelphia, including 300 police officers, and then later, after the publication of that, the federal government became interested in now doing a national representative sample. I think if you were to ask me what I think criminology should be doing more intensively than it has been, is trying to develop more theoretical perspective. Not necessarily a unified theory of crime, but more intense and precise and testable theories.
It all started for me in the early 1930s when I was a graduate student at Harvard and became interested in what was emerging as a functional orientation in sociological thought, largely derivative from the functional work of Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski in anthropology, and deriving, in my opinion, ultimately from Durkheim. And so when I finished my own studies, formal studies as a graduate student, I wanted to develop a formal exposition of what functional analysis amounted to. And in the event I did, and as was to be the case for the rest of my academic life, I developed it in lectures to students to begin with. So there was the microenvironment to begin with. Well, as you say, social structure and anomy focused on the question of what might account for differential rates of deviant behavior of various kinds. within a society. Consequently, it could not focus on individuals. We'll come back to that, because your critique of part of SS&A was very compelling and took off from that point. But continue with your question. So what I had to wrestle with was the question of what is there about some aspects of our social and cultural structure that might generate these differentials in rates. So the properties had to be properties of social structure. There had to be goals which are not individually evolved, but are culturally defined and culturally reinforced. It had to be location within the social structure, but those aren't individuals. Those are locations which are shared by an indefinitely large number of individuals. And it was the basic insight, to use a term I don't take too kindly, insight, was to examine the interaction between the cultural structure and the social structure, and to identify what I thought to be a disjunction between them. Here was the American dream, the cultural definition, saying that all of us in American society, what is distinctive of American society is that we all have a legitimate right to seek positive outcomes, success, not only material success, that we are the doctrine, the ideology, the cultural definition, that we are an egalitarian society, and we do not in principle exclude any, which means all of those objectives are legitimate goals. Now that's very different from a feudalistic society that segments objectives for different parts of it. At the same time, that is a disjunction from the social facts of the case, namely a social, a class structure, an ethnic structure, later, much later, decades later, a gender structure that provides differential access to these opportunities. So it was that notion of the disjunction between two aspects of the society, and not owing to attributes of individuals, of feeble-mindedness or of aggressiveness or what, and that was at the focus. And that was, for me, and continued to be, the breakthrough, the distinctively sociological perspective, which of course does not deny other spheres of investigation which focus on individual differences. I developed something I called a paradigm of functional analysis. Now this was a quarter century or so before Tom Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions gave a very special and powerful meaning to the notion of paradigm. I had a more limited notion, namely a formal statement of the underlying assumptions, the fundamental concepts, the problematics, and the mode in which this kind of analysis would take course. In doing that, I became powerfully impressed by the way in which functional analysis had centered on functions, on the positive consequences of structures and of actors operating within social structures. And so I turned to the correlative notion of dysfunctions, the notion I took from medicine and biology, and started to look at the dysfunctions, the negative consequences for the structure and for classes of individuals within the structure of anything that was being explored. And so it was when I presented some ideas on bureaucracy. I focused on the dysfunctions of bureaucracy, whereas Max Weber, who of course created the tradition of work in bureaucracy, had only centered on positive functions. When I came to think of social conformity, I said, but what about social deviation, deviant behavior? And again, it was on what seems to be dysfunctional, but I soon concluded that that wasn't the interesting problem, as you know. The problem was what makes for deviant behavior, and particularly for differential rates of deviant behavior among various parts of the population. So that's the most general theoretical context of how SS&A appeared in lectures at first and then found print in 1938.
When I graduated from Harvard and was contemplating graduate school, I applied to about a dozen or 15 different places, and I was turned down at all of them. That is, for financial aid. It wasn't a problem of admissions. I was turned down at almost all of them. And it turned out, to make a long story short, that the factor that was principally responsible was that I was Jewish. And there just wasn't very much financial aid available at American universities for Jewish candidates. My record, my credentials, were probably as strong as those of anybody in the country on paper. Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude, at Harvard University.
What year was this now? So just we could place it in time.
1939. And by midsummer or thereabouts, incidentally, I had one document bearing upon this. I actually had a letter in one instance from the acting chairman of a department in a state university saying that it was the policy of the university, quote, not to hire Jews, unquote. We were talking about first-year graduate students. And he said, we think the world of your record and your sponsors, your Talcott Parsons, Robert Merton, and so on. And we are going to recommend you, the department, but don't expect anything. And nothing came of it. That was the only instance in which I had a documentary evidence, but it was fairly clear that that was the pattern. I thought I had heard from all these schools, but I was mistaken. It was around midsummer, and I was beginning to look for employment, and resigning myself to not going to graduate school when I got a telegram from Edwin Sutherland at Indiana University offering me a TA, which I immediately embraced, right? And presently found myself at Indiana University.
You, I think, as a graduate student and an undergraduate student, were in a very unique position in that you had an undergraduate course, or perhaps even courses, with Robert Merton, and then you had graduate courses with Edwin Sutherland. Can you talk about those experiences, what they were like as teachers? And
well, I was singularly fortunate as both an undergraduate and a graduate student. I took my first course in sociology, the introductory course, with Pitram Sorokin, whose name perhaps today doesn't resonate quite so much, but it was something to reckon with then. And that resulted in what I can only describe as a conversion to sociology.
I see.
I was just intoxicated by the idea of the social systems and cultures. That was in my sophomore year. In my junior year, I took a course in social institutions with Talcott Parsons. And that was a tremendous intellectual experience and a very different perspective on sociology from that which was conveyed by Sorokin. And then in my senior year, I took a course in social organization with Robert Merton. And he was a quite young man then, although he was getting to be well known, and his paper on social structure and anomie had already been published. And we read that paper.
is it fair to say, thinking about the classic work that you did, Delinquent Boys, published in 1955, that grew out of your 1951 dissertation, that you eventually took at Harvard, right?
I couldn't I couldn't have written that book. I couldn't have written that thesis.
Right.
Had it not been for the Harvard background.
Right.
Because when I went to Indiana University, I couldn't have asked the questions about differential association in subcultures.
Well, I think an interesting article that I completed, which actually has hardly ever been cited, is the article on the effects of labelling in 1977. And I think that was interesting because I really took labelling theory seriously and I tried to test it empirically. And the results were fairly clear-cut in showing that people did commit more offences after being convicted, after being officially labelled. And I thought it was a good paper, but the problem was the labelling theorists were anti-empirical, so they ignored it. And then the empirical people were kind of anti-labelling theory, so they ignored it. And also it was in the British Journal of Criminology, which Americans ignored anyway. So I thought that was a good paper, which was largely ignored, I'm sorry to say.
Do you think theories really would be able to integrate these very diverse levels of problems?
Well, this is a challenge, I think. Historically, the people who were interested in neighbourhood influences generally ignored the individual difference factors, and certainly the biological factors, and vice versa. Historically, people who were interested in individual difference factors ignored neighbourhood. In a way, that's one of the strengths of the Chicago study, that they're trying to go from the neighbourhood to the individual, which is a good thing. But to try and develop theories that incorporate all these levels is a great challenge. But I do think in our longitudinal studies, we've largely ignored situational influences. I think there's a clear message there that we should be, you know, our focus has been more on how does the, if you like, the antisocial personality develop, or how does the person with low inhibitions develop, how does, you know, if you like, criminal potential develop. And we haven't really focused so much on how does criminal potential become manifest in criminal behaviour. So we should really be asking more questions about how, you know, when offences happened, how did they happen, where did they happen, who was involved, who was the victim. These things are asked in some areas of criminology, in the situational areas, like, for example, the Ron Clark situational crime prevention approach. And I'd like to see more linkage, in a way, of the strengths of the longitudinal approach with the strengths of the situational approach or the neighbourhood approach. But all these things are great challenges. In a way, that, you know, they're not things that one person can do easily. Perhaps they're things that you need big studies to do.
Yeah, and also not a single investigator will solve.
Well, that's right. Again, that's where you need collaborators, you see, because everyone has different strengths and knowledge in these different areas. Another
linkage that you have really brought to the field is the linkage between longitudinal studies and experimental studies. Perhaps you can kind of tell a little bit more about, you know, kind of how that type of connection, how you developed it and why you think it's important.
Well, I've always focused on method, and I've always advocated systematic observation and experiment. They are the basis of the scientific method. And I did some systematic observation studies on shoplifting, you know, where we followed people through stores, and also...
You planted also things to be stolen.
Exactly. I did the lost letter studies, which were experimental observational studies, where we left money and letters on the street with different messages, and we investigated whether or not people stole them and what influenced that. And that's experimental criminology, which I think we need. So I'm a great believer in experiments. I like the randomized experiments in evaluating prevention and treatment methods. And also, of course, I'm a great believer in the longitudinal method. So it was natural to try and combine the two, and to recommend that we should try and combine the two, so that you get, each has sort of complementary strengths and problems. The longitudinal study has the strength of really tracing development through time, but a weakness of not really demonstrating causal impact. No, what I was advocating really was a multiple component study with different interventions at different ages. So, I mean, if we go back to the original Farrington, Olin, Wilson design, which I quite like actually, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 24, 4 cohorts followed up, and an intervention in each. So the birth cohort, you get into age 3, and then you have a preschool intervention combined with parent training. The age 6 cohort, you get into age 9, then you can have some kind of, again, parent training combined with individual skills training. The age 12 cohort, at age 15, again, you're going to have individual skills training, possibly peer influence resistance training, trying to stop them taking drugs or committing delinquent acts. And the age 18 cohort up to age 21, then you might want to have, again, some sort of skills training and employment training things. So I think you'd have different interventions for different age cohorts, and I think you'd learn a lot from doing that. Within one study, you could provide a lot of information about development over time, and also about how to change development over time, about how to improve people so that they're less delinquent.
Right.
When I joined the Institute of Criminology, I knew very little about criminology. Now, obviously, I know a lot more. I don't know, I think it was a psychiatric study, really, at the time, because of Donald West's interest. I mean, Donald West was an excellent researcher and a brilliant mentor to me. But it was a very psychiatrically orientated study. I think it could have been more wide-ranging, and we could have measured more things. I mean, for example, if you look at the biological side, we measured heart rate at one age, and we found that violent offenders had low heart rates. That was an exciting result. Why didn't we measure it at all ages? You know, it's easy enough to measure the pulse rate when you look back. And lots of things like that, really, that we could have measured more wide-ranging things, perhaps more sociological things as well.
Now, most of your research has been focusing on the development of offending in males.
Yeah.
Was that really governed by the Cambridge study?
Well, to a large extent, I think. Although in the Cambridge study, I have investigated in the 1990s relationships between offending of the men and the sisters, for example, brothers versus sisters, fathers versus mothers, and how far criminal careers of one generation are related to criminal careers of the next generation, or within generations as opposed to between generations.
Without being dogmatic about it, I think what is really important in your work, I think, is that evidence counts,
absolutely.
rather than opinion.
Absolutely,
and that there are positive ways of dealing,
absolutely.
with very complicated social processes.
Definitely. At the end of the day, it's the evidence that matters. With everything we have to say, what's the evidence?
Very good. I think we should close on that.
Okay, very good.
Well, I thought I would spend the next little while sort of talking to you folks about what now amounts to 2 decades of me doing feminist criminology, and I thought I would do both a conceptual and personal account of this trip, and then hopefully you can chime in with your own insights and thoughts. First of all, if we take a look at feminist criminology globally, and I think it's now emerged as a discipline, and we can look at its history, I was certainly a part of, I guess, the early years of that history, and I would go to, usually there would be one session on women's issues in professional meetings, and that was it. And that session would always be standing room only, and generally in those sessions, there might be 1 or 2 papers on the issues that have become feminist criminology, and most of those papers would deal with issues of women's victimization. And I was there in the early years when we were still dealing with language issues about, is forcible rape something, do we need to say forcible? What's going on with sexual assault? What's going on with the treatment of victims? If I would go to a session that would have papers on feminist criminology, it would be almost exclusively around issues of women's victimization. And there was enormous work to be done there, obviously. I think that the success of that branch of feminist criminology, though, in part speaks to the fact that it didn't pose the kind of problematics for the field that the area that I ultimately ended up in would pose. It created new men to label as criminal. It created new crimes to study. I mean, in that sense, it was a void, and suddenly people rushed in to do this research. And it ultimately was also a problematic area, I think, for a lot of feminist scholars, because you got into very uneasy alliances with get tough folks, and that the field has sort of had some struggles around issues about alliances with people who have very short and often not correct responses. And certainly the mandatory arrest road that folks went running down is one example of that. The other area that received some attention, and I would go, and there would be a paper or 2 on this, had to do with women as workers in the system. And this, we're just going through the standard litany in your Women in Crime book. As I think about why that area grew up, it grew up because of the civil rights issues. And women were, trying to get into medical school, they were trying to get into law school, and they were trying to get into policing. And so, as women started knocking on those doors in the early 70s, they started experiencing victories in courts, and suddenly this issue became very salient, what was going to happen with women, particularly in the police, forces of America. At the same time, there was a kind of parallel set of activities really in the area of the history of corrections. And I think this is probably history for you folks, but Estelle Friedman's book, when it came out, everybody read it. You know, Their Sisters' Keepers, and the idea that women invented corrections was an amazing thing for me to discover. So there were these sort of parallel tracks. Again, the final area that I would say has received a lot of attention in women and workers in corrections has to do with the issue of gender bias in the courts. And if you look at that literature, and I've been around the edges of it, that's, as women got into law schools, it's like, duh, law school is sexist. And wow, when we got out of law school, there was the court system in America, and it was worse than law school. And so a lot of privileged women who went into law and who got into sort of mid-career positions began to push on issues of gender bias in the courts. And the reports that came out of that effort really did deal largely with two areas, the experience of women lawyers in courtrooms and the experience of women plaintiffs, particularly women who are going through divorces. And to some degree, that group also revisited the issue of women victims and the treatment of women on the stand as victims. Now we get to my area, which is, I think, if you look at if you just sort of stacked up all the books on women's victimization, you stacked up the books on women's correction, women in policing and corrections, it's going to be a shorter pile. When you get to women offenders, it's a very short pile. And I've thought a lot about why have I been so both fortunate and misfortunate in my choice of areas of interest. I'd like to argue that, first of all, ultimately this area of work is the most interesting because it's the most threatening to patriarchy, because we're now talking about unruly and potentially violent women. And there's an agency and a threat there that doesn't exist. I mean, that women want to be like men in police work, it doesn't really threaten patriarchy. That women, and especially the construction of women as plundered waifs, never threaten patriarchy. But the idea that women could kill men, that kind of fear that is there, sort of like Nat Turner and the slave revolt. I mean, it's the fact that it could even possibly happen, that Lizzie Borden could actually take an axe to her stepmother and father is a scary thing. And so there's something there that I think is much more interesting for criminology ultimately, because the field really grew up theorizing about crime and the causes of crime. And it grew up, of course, completely ignoring the causes of women's crime. Race, gender, and class, though, put the work at the center, I think. And that's one of the things that's happened over the ensuing decades when I got into this field, and I'll back up into my own personal stories. It really was kind of a boutique area. You really had to convince people that it was important to even think about it, because especially adult women offenders were such a small portion of those in prisons and jails, about 3%. We were able to document was that the women in prison had, first of all, that prostitution wasn't a minor theme in women's more serious offending. It was sort of the major door through which women walked. And that many of the women who were prostitutes had earlier been girls on the streets. And that many of those women had a history of victimization, sexual and physical victimization, got in trouble with drugs, fell in with bad men, and how prostitutes get involved in other kinds of crime is that prostitution is something you really don't want to do for very long. And I guess now, increasingly, theorizing about crime has begun to incorporate in a very sort of focused way, with, I think, all the emphasis on masculinities, gender. And of course, there's this discovery, God, if gender matters for women, does gender matter for men? And looking at that literature, I can see that I would also claim that is a part of the feminist criminological project. Starting in 1980, the number of women in prison has tripled, quadrupled, quintupled, depends upon the base year that you want to talk about. I'm suddenly now in tremendous demand in ways that I never anticipated to talk about the issues of women offenders to people who are opening up women's prisons in every state in our country. When I first started this work, about half of our states had no women's prisons at all. And now every state's opening them, building them, filling them, and overcrowding them. So tremendous issues that have to be grappled with in terms of what's going on there. And then because, and I'm so, glad that Vicky's joined the project here, because one of the issues, of course, is that this has disproportionately affected women of color, and particularly African American women. And it's, when we talk about gender, race, and class and feminist criminology, this is, a place where we could all join hands in a kind of important work together to talk sense to people who are jailing women. Most of the women we're jailing, without going into tedious detail, are not violent offenders, the stereotype notwithstanding. Most are drug offenders. Many are the ones, I talked about that trajectory. Certainly race plays out, in different ways in the lives of the women on those trajectories, but essentially, if you look at a woman in prison, and we just saw a wonderful video this afternoon, issues of physical and sexual abuse and severe traumas litter the lives of almost all of the women in prison. They're in for drug offenses, they're in for petty property crimes, and then there are the ones who are in for violent offenses, and those women, a big chunk of them, about half of them, are in for killing abusive spouses.
So Dewey said, good research should scratch where it itches. Right. Obviously, drugs in the United States today really itches. So I was very interested in how police go about making arrests for drugs, why they have so many blacks compared to whites. And then that led me to all the business about, well, how many whites actually use drugs compared to how many whites get arrested, how many blacks use compared to how many blacks get arrested, and what are the policies in other countries, and the Netherlands especially, where we have the best data, but also some Scandinavian countries and Austria. They also have basically decriminalized it. So in connection with that, then it occurred to me to ask the question, well, why has this become such a big issue? How has it happened that drugs became a big issue? Was this driven by the 60s, which was my first assumption? That it was, all the kids started smoking pot, and they turned on professors, and they turned on some of their parents. And they were, is that then what caused this great concern over drugs? So I started looking through public opinion polls to see, what does it look like? And I was astounded to discover that, in fact, the public opinion didn't begin to reflect a real concern over drugs until they had been bombarding the public with how much danger there was in it from police and from politicians and from the media for nearly 20 or 30 years. And then the public begins saying, well, maybe there is a problem here. So it's clearly a problem that has been politically driven, a problem that's been driven by the media and by law enforcement agencies trying to buff up their budgets and make themselves more important and more powerful and more independent of any kinds of external control.
Now that's all together disappeared, hasn't it? The case study of one professional thief, and now we have more aggregate studies of property crimes and those sort of things. Why do you think that disappeared?
Well, it comes and goes, I mean, Sutherland did his, but nobody did anything, I don't think, until I did Boxman, and then a couple of others came out. Jackson did one. And then one of the reasons, I think, Mark, is because you don't just run into these guys every day. And if you do, I mean, frankly, most of them aren't that interesting. They don't have insights. They don't have self-analysis. And I mean, I met a lot of professional thieves in the course of the work, but most of them I wouldn't have written a book about. I wouldn't even have written an article about. But they don't have enough information. They don't see their world in a perceptive enough way to make it worthwhile. So if you think about the likelihood of meeting someone like that, pretty slim. And I suspect, that somewhere you probably will run across somebody in Marielito, and you'll write a book about him or her, because you'll find out this person really is going to give us some insights that are going to be important. And that's, of course, what you're looking for. You're not just looking for any old person who comes along and says, yeah, I'm a thief, write a book about me.
What do you see as a viable or meaningful research agenda for criminologists vis-a-vis the war on drugs? What should we be doing?
But I think we need to do more comparative research. I think we need to have more data that will show that it's worked to decriminalize it in the Netherlands, it's worked to decriminalize it in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, in Austria, in Spain. I think we need to get a massive amount of data, because I think that will be the most convincing thing. right now, and I've given some speeches on this to public groups, and right now they say, yeah, but the Netherlands isn't the United States. And so it's kind of easy to dismiss one case. In a sense, it is one case where it has worked really well. So we need more data like that. But criminologists need to take a stand. And the American Society of Criminology needs to say, and the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences needs to make a public statement, as they have against death penalty, against the war on drugs, and say this is not working. We need to decriminalize drugs. So within our society, we need to work very hard to get a policy statement so that we can go to the politicians and say, you know, the major research organizations studying crime in the United States have come out with the statement that we must decriminalize drugs. And then I think we also need to develop concrete policies for what happens when you decriminalize them. We need to, of course, separate decriminalization from legalization, but have policies where we say exactly what we think should be done. I have some ideas along those lines, but it would be hard to build consensus. But I mean, clearly we can decriminalize pot tomorrow, and the pot smoking rate will probably go down somewhat, but it won't change it very much. Right.
Going on to Skid Row, would you like to tell us a little bit about
what I was interested in? I didn't have any idea of studying organized crime or anything like that, but some work was being done on policing and how police made decisions to make arrests. Most of it was being done by people riding around in police cars. And I thought that was giving a distorted view because I didn't think the police were actually going to behave the same way with a sociologist in the car as they would when they were not being observed. So I started to go down to where most of the arrests were made. And in every city, most of the arrests were made in a very small area of the city, Burgess's concentric zone. And so I went down there dressed as a truck driver, which I had been a truck driver when I was going to college, so I felt comfortable. And I went down in khakis, and I shaved my beard. But I would go down with a couple of days' growth, so I looked like I was And I just started watching how the police behaved, and quite by accident discovered a bag man from the police department coming in to pick up his money in one of these places that was, I thought, just a restaurant where I used to go, and had gotten friendly with a waitress who was an ex-heroin addict and an ex-prostitute. And then I said, you know, why is he coming in here with, and then she said, well, he's the bag man. I mean, it was like asking for a donut. She says, we only have chocolate. She said, well, he's the bag man. I said, yeah, oh, from the police. She said, yeah. And I said, well, why do you have to pay him off? And they said, well, because of the gambling room in the back. I said, oh, I said, well, can I go in there? And she said, well, sure. Just watch your wallet. So then I got into it, and that's how I discovered that there was, in fact, this huge industry in gambling. And then, of course, I got into the drugs and prostitution and high-interest loans and all the other kinds of things that were organized around illegal activities in the city. And after about 6 months of that, I had reached a kind of plateau. I didn't seem to be getting any further. I'd gotten quite a bit of information, but I wasn't able to break into the higher echelons. I knew pretty much how it worked on the low level of the gambling and the drugs and prostitution and how they were distributed, where the drugs were hidden and things at that time. But I couldn't get much further. And so I decided, well, you know, I might as well come clean with some of these people and see what will happen, because this isn't doing me much good. So I called up one of my informants, and I said, I'd like to take you to lunch tomorrow. And he said, sure, where should we meet? We'd had lunch together downtown. I said, well, come to the university and meet me at my office. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, just come, because we'd become friends, and he trusted me. So he came out, and then he came to my office, and I said, you know, I hope you don't mind the deception, but I feel bad about the deception, but I didn't think there was any way that I could find out and participate. And if I just said, he said, well, he said, you know, I didn't know. He said, I could tell you lots of things. And so what I had been getting just by questioning, without acting like I was trying to get information, was quite a bit of information, mostly inadvertently revealed by these people. But the strange thing was, I thought that this probably would blow the research, that that was going to be the end of it, and I wouldn't get any further. What was really strange was that once I told this guy and then other people, look, I'm a professor at the university, and I'm interested in studying organized crime. You know you can trust me. It's totally confidential. I will never reveal anything I find out in any way that could hurt anybody I'm connected with. And you can be sure that's true because I've had this information for 6 months, and obviously I haven't. Then I started getting phone calls from people I didn't know saying, I understand, and some were kind of like, I understand you're interested in organized crime. You kind of shake on the other end of the phone, try to be cool, say, yes, I will have an academic interest in. So they get phone calls of guys saying, listen, why don't you come and have a drink with me, or, I'm going to be at such a place, or, you might want to check out this bank president that has. And suddenly I started getting all kinds of information, some of it just like that.
The early days, if we can talk about back in the early 70s, with Law Enforcement Assistance Administration and Price Foster, who was in the federal government with the, what was the, I guess the higher education program.
Right, LEAP.
And in the early 70s, a lot of discussion as to where the field was going and, what should be the requirements, concern about standards, concern about some of the developments, and that led to the formation of the Joint Commission on Criminology and Criminal Justice Standards, which was formed, I guess, in 1976. And it was made up of representatives from the American Society of Criminology and the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. And that group went through a number of iterations in terms of its development. In looking at standards, and eventually Vince was brought in to head up the project as project director, and between us we slowly, I guess, worked toward some agreement. And I guess I should say in those early days, as I suppose there is today, there was much disagreement as to where the field was going and how it would develop. We did come out with a set of standards, which, as I look back on them, were probably very minimum. And Vince took over and was largely responsible for drafting the final report, which was the beginning, I guess, of an effort that now spans well over 20 years.
Well, what was happening at that time, we're talking the early 1990s now, a lot of things had changed. We all, as Vince mentioned earlier, in the late 70s, Larry Sherman's Quality of Police Education came out, that book. And that book got a lot of press, and the issue was whether Handcuffs 101 type courses were still around or whether we had passed that stage. That is whether, whether criminal justice had achieved academic legitimacy in one way or another. And I was concerned whether or not we had passed that stage or not. Also, during the 80s was the demise of LEAA. LEAA ultimately died in 1980. The government support for police education had died out a few years earlier than that. And the fears that this criminal justice as an academic discipline would die had gone away. People realized criminal justice was here to stay. And even if we in criminal justice thought it was here to stay, many people in academia didn't believe it. We were considered, I think, by many in the traditional disciplines as sort of a flash in the pan kind of a thing. So even with police officers no longer being supported for getting undergraduate and graduate degrees, and even with the demise of LEAA, programs were thriving. And they didn't grow dramatically in numbers, but they grew dramatically in size.
Well, it's interesting looking at your contributions over your career. I can't think of a more varied and diverse body of research. You started out by looking at criminological theory. In fact, did some very important work in 1964 looking at the urban correlates of crime. You looked at criminal behavior typologies, white-collar crime, the social ecology of crime, differential association theory, the sociology of criminal law, labeling theory, conflict theory, Marxist theory, and spiritual theory. And I may have left some out, but that was my shopping list from your CV. Yeah. And I guess one of my questions is, how do you account for that development? Because I don't think that that's a normal intellectual development of most people in the field.
Well, I suppose I'm told it's comfortable to follow a particular topic your whole career. On the other hand, I'm easily bored, I think. And after I do something one way, I feel like that's opened a certain kind of understanding, in this case, a particular kind of crime. and I then want to go on to looking at it another way.
I see.
Also the idea of multiple realities, you know, no one way is the answer.
Well, I think that's also what I get a sense from reading your autobiographical statements, that there's a sense that the search for outer peace needs to start with the self, and as one finds inner peace.
Yeah.
And then that becomes part of a group. I mean, I don't want to simplify it. It's a very complex process, but nonetheless, it's a starting point in terms of the self. And it seems that that is coming through your recent work in particular.
Yeah, well, peacemaking criminology, there are different ways of doing it. People do it, think different things about it. I'm impressed with just the notion of social peace. And almost by definition, whenever there's crime, there's lack of social peace. So what makes for social peace, you know? And it's certain all the exterior things we do, but if we don't have some kind of inner peace to begin with, we don't make the forms that make an external peace, so the two go together. I think you have to work. So the solution to crime would be social justice, but how do you get social justice? And you don't get social justice out of violence and hate.
And this would be along the lines of what you've written about in terms of compassionate criminology, the notions of cooperation and compassion.
Right.
Yeah.
Then those who, right.
Yeah.
Then we create a kind of society that is not unequal, that is not racist, does not have poverty, that has home for everyone.
Could you speculate a bit on the future direction for criminological theory? Where would you like to see it go?
Yeah. You could say that, or wonder, what new is there to say, you know, what way is there to go? And right now, various forms of postmodernism, multiple understandings. Saying that, I still think that probably the important work is to maybe repeat the right things for a long time. You know, in a way, I think we know enough about crime. We know its causes, its consequences, all the values associated with it. We know how the media covers it and how we're bombarded with images. The question is not what kind of criminology or how much more criminology, but it's a world in what we know is put into action, I think, you know. But yet we have our careers, we're entrenched in the university and departments, even more so in criminology now that we have criminal justice departments and criminology departments. So we keep going on doing this. But I think the change will come not by the kind of criminology we go on, but by saying the right things that many of that have been said already.
Well, in 1975, an event took place that certainly made Freda Adler a household name in criminology circles, and that was the publication of your book, Sisters in Crime, by McGraw-Hill. What would you say is the central thesis of the book, and did you have any idea it would be as successful as it was?
Well, that's a very good question. I wrote Sisters in Crime, and as I mentioned before, there were only 6 books written before, starting with Lombroso in 1898, and then W.I. Thomas, and then Otto Pollack, of the Glucks, and then Otto Pollack, and then a couple on women in prison. And I had very small literature search, and then I had written my dissertation on a female criminal in Philadelphia. And I said to myself, well, here's an area that really is uncharted, and it was a challenge. But actually, there was a little serendipity involved. During the course of my drug studies, we interviewed the clients of the drug programs. And interviewing the young women, I asked them, how do you support your habit? Because I expected that they would give me the female criminal role, shoplifting or prostitution. I just began to hear more burglary, selling stolen goods. I heard a story, I guess one that I'll never forget, of a woman by the name of Marge. I asked her, and she said, well, she did start out, she was a prostitute, but she was Catholic, and so she thought that that was not a good illegal job. So she became a bank robber.
Oh.
And it was I'll never forget her. But you see the sequence. I saw women who were becoming involved in behaviors that I didn't expect they were involved in. And then it was also a time when we were reading quite a bit about from 67, 68 on into the 70s, about women involved in terrorist activities. The Bader Meinhof gang, half women. The queen of the Japanese Red Army, a woman. Lila Khalad was very involved. It was in more of a liberation organization, but still a Muslim woman involved. And I began seeing more young women involved as gang members. I looked at the statistics in 1972, and I saw that women had been 4% of the arrest statistic in 1960, and by the time I looked in 72, they were up to 18% of arrests. And that there were prostitutes had formed a union called Coyote, and they were much more assertive. There were several women, several all-girl gangs. Not many, but in the large cities, all-girl gangs were developing, not auxiliaries. And then I thought, well, now it's my time. It's a good topic, something I can really get involved in, and I wrote Sisters in Crime. Jay, I had no idea that there would be such a reaction to the book. I thought the book was common sense, and it was not really a theory, it was an hypothesis, and that it wasn't, I mean, it was okay. I was happy with it at the end, but I think that it became such a popular book because of the political times. I think that this is a book, a scientific book, that would have been on the shelf, like so many scientific books, and that would have been it. But given that it was a time of women's liberation, of political fervor, of equal opportunity for women, this book became very politicized. It became a book that was a threat to the women's liberation movement. The thesis of the book, the hypothesis of the book, is simple. It simply says that as women's illegitimate role in society changes, so too will her illegitimate role. Why? Well, you can talk about opportunity theory, you can talk about less social control, you can talk about more strain, you could fill in the intervening variables any way you want. But for all of these reasons, that when we saw women changing their position on the illegitimate ladder, for the shopper was the shoplifter. Now you have women with fiduciary capacity. They can embezzle. There were no women in Watergate. There were no women working in those jobs. So that it seemed to me that crime would change as roles changed, and that there wasn't anything particularly dramatic about that statement. But it triggered a reaction, and that was, don't say anything about female crime changing.
Joan, I'd like to start by asking you, how did you get involved in the field of criminology?
There are a lot of different ways you could answer that question, and since both of us deal with autobiographical histories, I'm hesitant to give you a single answer. Okay. But one possible and one explanation is the fact that I was working at Wiltwyck in 1953, and that was a school for the treatment of juvenile delinquents. And there were kids there who were murderers, who had been exceedingly violent, and yet who on a one-to-one contact seemed personable, intelligent, and unlikely to commit the crimes that I knew from the records they had in fact committed. And it piqued my curiosity.
At what point, and from there, how did that influence your career in terms of education? What was the career path that led you to?
During the next year, I was a research assistant for Eleanor Maccabee, who was doing work on socialization and particularly interested in what made children aggressive. She gave me as my first project a review of the criminological literature to try to understand that in terms of socialization history.
You actually have been a real supporter of the need for more experiments in the field of criminology. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems to build on this early experience in your intellectual career. Are you more hopeful about the possibilities for experiments now in criminology?
Yes, I think there are a number of people who have demonstrated that you can do experiments in the courts, that you can do experiments in the way in which children are treated when they're sent to some kind of reform schools, and there are lots of ways that we can do experiments to change socialization. For example, it's possible to experimentally identify, that means randomly identify, families to train in the use of non-punishment and techniques for using clear directions for how children ought to behave. We can do a lot more experimenting if we understand that we know less than we thought we knew.
It seems that much of your work is focused on the family.
Yes.
And what is it about the family, in your view, that lends itself to such a prominent role in the study of crime causation?
There really are two reasons for my focus on family. One of them is the one you're suggesting. The second one is the fact that the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study has the best records on family that you can get, because over a 5.5-year period, a social worker was going in, actually usually 2 social workers, so you have more than one perspective, walking into a home, recording what was happening, who was talking to whom, who was shouting. They were so widely accepted that all kinds of behavior are recorded in the records that you simply don't get by a very short picture of the family at the dining room table, certainly don't get by interviewing either the parents or the children, because it was possible to continue with the records and to see quite validly what was happening in the family. The second reason is, at least in our society, everybody, to my knowledge, believes they have a family. And because even if your family has deserted you, you have expectations about them. That places the family at the core of all sorts of things that come out of it, either the disappointment you feel in your family or the pleasure you feel. It's a way of generating who you are, in my opinion.
Can you give us a little bit of information on how you became involved in criminology?
I suppose some people might question why a person who grew up in rural Illinois where there was no violence has spent a good deal of his life studying violence. And it's a fair question. I certainly didn't experience a lot of violence in my childhood. I became very much aware of the potentials for violence, however, when, as I was growing up in a small town where a black person, they bragged, had never spent the night. We had a quartet from a traditional black college who sang at the Baptist church, where my parents were very active. And they wanted to spend the night in that little town. They had their own trailer. And my father was a deacon of the church, and he and a bunch of the other deacons watched over that trailer all night for fear that some of the local residents might not appreciate their presence. And that set me to thinking. In addition to that, my father was a high school teacher and principal, and he taught a course called sociology, which had very little to do with sociology as we know it, but which had a great deal to do with social problems, including crime and delinquency. So that was sort of a natural thing that led me to be interested. When you ask youngsters about their delinquency, it turns out they implicate their friends, and we always ask them, you know, do you do these things by yourself, with your friends, and so on. And so the interest in companionship, co-offending, if you will, led sort of naturally to the study of gangs. Al Cohen and I had begun a collaboration growing out of a friendship in which we decided that we should look at delinquent subcultures. And this was a couple of years before the Cloward and Olin book, which was published in 1960. Al and I had an article in the Journal of Social Issues in 1958. Interestingly enough, at the ASA meeting in Seattle, in which that paper was given first, that was the meeting where Fred Strodbeck approached me about coming to the University of Chicago and heading up a gang project. We knew at the time that paper was given that it had already been accepted for publication, but it had not yet been published. So, to make another long story short, I agreed to go back to Chicago to meet with people from the University of Chicago and with various gang researchers and theorists and people from the YMCA of Metropolitan Chicago, which had a detached worker, a so-called detached worker project, and to talk about what needed to be done to test out some formulations concerning gang delinquency. At that first meeting in the fall of, or in the spring of maybe it was the fall of 1958, Phil Hauser, who was a chair of the Department of Sociology at Chicago, Fred Strodbeck, and Walter Miller, Lloyd Olin, and Al Cohen all attended, plus some of the YMCA people. And out of that meeting came some of the ideas that went into the NIMH application, which then resulted in the collaboration. And I took leave from Washington State and went. I was on loan for 3 years, 1 year at a time, and that was another great turning point for my career.
How did you start to get involved internationally when no one else was doing it?
Well, the whole thing is relatively simple. When I was, must have been about 17, 18 I guess it was, in college, I encountered Edgar Hewitt, who turned out to be the leading archaeologist of New Mexico and of the Southwest archaeology. He came to our university and gave a talk. I'd had a course in anthropology, and off I went under, he had an idea of a archaeological and anthropological field school in New Mexico, run by the University of New Mexico. So I went out to study one summer on the Jemez Plateau, Pueblo Indians, went to their dances. I was 18. I went back when I was 19 and lived the whole summer with the Navajo Indians excavating Chaco Canyon in one of the ruins at Chaco Canyon in northern New Mexico.
And the world never was the same after that. I remember the pictures, photographs I had. I used to show people like I do a foreign country now, and it was very much. So I lived on the Navajo reservation back in the early 30s, and it left an impact that stayed me forever.
What attracted you to India, and what relationship does that have to the criminological works that you've done internationally since then?
Well, I went with the Ford Foundation to India as an advisor to the government of India, in an attempt to try to change the slums of India, the worst probably in the world, by self-help, not by philanthropy, the rich, nor contributions, nor by the government efforts, but to get them doing themselves. And the whole idea of self-help, of trying to take care of yourself, I was very much influenced and accepting it by the work of Shaw and McKay and Saul Alinsky in Chicago and the so-called Chicago area projects and Back of the Yards movement, where they try to get local areas to try to change the problem of crime. And in the case of India, it shifted to sanitation, health, and improvement economically and all of it by their own efforts. So that's what it is. Actually, it not directly tied to crime. I got the ideas partly from that, from self-help stuff. But I did give some lectures. I remember I talked to the college that gave, that trained the people who could run the Indian prisons. I gave them lectures occasionally in criminology, and I also worked with some other areas. But I did not go there for criminology. But curiously, a lot of my interest was derived from criminology. I think it's very important when you do research in another country, regardless of your political belief, you're a humanitarian, you keep your mouth shut. If you want to talk about it later, it's all right after you've left the country.
What else can you share?
Well, I think if you're not, if you don't willing to put up with a bit of hardship, if you're not interested in using some ingenuity, if you're not interested in following the customs of the country, the problem of you after all are a guest in the country with it. Always remembered in Uganda that it was essential to deal with the African elite, the head of the Division of Corrections, the head of the CID, the Intelligence Division, all of it. Any of those people that, even though I wore a bush shirt and was very informally dressed, I always dressed to the maximum when I saw them. That was an expression of my respect for them. It also was to show them, and I thought that I showed them their importance. Why study international crime?
Yeah, there are people who say that.
I think it's the only way you really get a perspective on what looks like homegrown stuff from an outside view, and I think that we don't have enough right now to be able to compare it. I think my Swiss study, it does have a chapter with some of it. It has, I think, great implications for crime control in this country.
It sounds like you think it would be reasonable to conclude that the Massachusetts experiment actually has had some significant long-term influence on how youth corrections works in this country. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think it is fair to say. I think that the movement towards small group homes, while the movement was evident in a number of places before that, the Massachusetts experience gave impetus to it because they closed all the institutions. The facilities were really turned over to other departments of state government. There was no chance to reopen them in a sense. And so the substitute programs had to be developed. Some substitute programs had to be developed to take care of this population. And by varying the content of those small group homes, let's say from quite secure programs where the controls that you could exercise were much stricter over the kids that came in that were pretty messed up. Then there were others that were more responsive to the treatment programs and needed new learning experiences and work on an outpatient sort of, or out with the families, and engagement even of other youth in the community in the programs that are taking place inside the facilities. So there's quite a set of variations, and it meant dividing up the different problems that youth presented, and then providing an institutional environment for them that would build on the strengths, deal with the weaknesses that the kids brought to the program.
What are the major research and policy issues now?
Well, as you know, there developed a period in the 80s and 90s in which the movement was to build more institutions for juveniles at the same time that some parts of the program were being moved out to the community in small group homes. And the security end of the system was enlarged on the assumption that rehabilitation was a waste of time and resources and would not work, and that therefore more stricter forms of regimentation in these larger institutions was the only thing. So in a sense, there was some turning back of the clock in that way, and I think a premature rejection of what kinds of programs might work with particular types of youth. In other words, I think the focus has begun to shift on, let's not have one program for everybody, because it's not going to work that way. Let's try to divide up the population, see what the needs are, what can be provided if you segregate the ones that are needing certain kinds of special treatments together and separate from others. So I think we're going to be seeing a movement, in a partial movement at least, into more community-based programs, partly because the problems of delinquency are seen as arising out of community contexts that encourage them, and which leads us back to the opportunity theory and what communities provide or don't provide in the way of legitimate opportunities and curtailed illegitimate opportunities.
But the victim survey shows, as we know, declining crime rates affecting all victim groups, and the police data shows the same thing. Precisely when that decline started, for what kinds of groups, is unclear, and it varies, but it's clear now it's for all groups over an extended period.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is? What do you think is different in America in the 1990s from America in the 1970s and 80s, when all these indicators were going up, at least for so far as the police were concerned, and for some groups the victimization was concerned? What's happened to make this a safer, more crime-free country?
Well, one healthy thing is a lot of speculation about what caused it. And so people are really discussing what is it that reduces crime at these kinds of levels and this effectively. So that kind of discussion is very good, because it raises the question, well, something's going on, but we don't know what. Now, one major change that has taken place is a change in police organizations and their systems of patrol and community policing. That's been a dramatic change in police work. And it's being adopted more and more by police and communities. It means that police are out there on foot patrols, interacting with the community, and not just in squad cars riding around. So that's one thing I think has affected, that the police are more engaged with the community are reporting more events to the police, and cooperating with the police in policing their own neighborhoods. Well, I think it's not commonly known that we first developed the ideas that went into the opportunity theory of delinquency while we were working on a comparative study of two institutions for juveniles, one a state institution and one a private institution. And we were very struck in studying those two institutions from a comparative standpoint about the different kinds of inmate subcultures that developed in the two training schools. And we were pressed to account for those differences. How come different values and norms and beliefs that evolved in one? How did different relationships develop with the staff? And therefore, what could we learn about the best ways to organize those environments to get the kinds of effects that we really want in dealing with juvenile offenders?
So that was sort of what we had as background for the publication of the delinquency and opportunity theory and the development of it in the community. So we reasoned that if you consider each community as organized around a set of legitimate opportunities for youth and a set of illegitimate opportunities arising in these days mostly from the drug world itself, that you would you'd be able to find new targets for changing institutions in the community to be more effective in channeling youth into legitimate opportunities rather than illegitimate ones. So those were the basic ideas. And fundamentally what it's sort of tried to say, and somehow that's not altogether clear in subsequent literature, is that the way a community is organized does have an impact on the types of norms and values and beliefs that evolve among the youth. And these will differ depending how the community itself is organized. So that brought in a social structure kind of set of concerns and related those to subcultural developments.
If you were asked what would you recommend for America right now in terms of crime prevention, have you got some strategies you could share with us?
Oh, definitely. As you well know, you're the reason why I was forced eventually to consider whether my theorizing had any policy implications. Your idea of getting all us theorists to come clean on what we really thought without any wishy-washy dilly-dallying about the point was a good one. So it forced me to sit down and think through a number of things, and I came out with a number of, you asked for them, you got them, a few cases. That is plain, straight statements, very simple, don't try to fuzzy it up, qualify it too much, or cite everything in sight. So I did come out with a number of things. For example, against my long-held convictions, I found that I had to come out saying, get rid of the death penalty. I'd been arguing with my spouse years over this. She's always been against it. I was saying, well, maybe in some cases people ought to be killed. But then I became increasingly convinced not only that it's hopeless to think we will eliminate all error and all discrimination in the system, but that the perpetuation of capital punishment in this country is one of the major and most hurtful symbols of our history of racial oppression and racial discrimination. This is, as long as we have capital punishment, legalized judicial murder, as some people call it, as long as we have it, no matter whether it deters or didn't deter, and there's absolutely no convincing evidence of a deterrent effect, it's something that aggravates what is a worsening danger to this country, and that is the racial conflicts which are erupting and which are getting worse, certainly in places such as Southern California, where I live.
What about, this 3 years that you spent in the police department? It seems to me that was your interest in then becoming in law enforcement, becoming a cop, or was this purely kind of
no, if anything, that convinced me that I definitely did not want a career as a cop. It was actually a relatively enlightened and civilized police force to be working on in those days. A very good chief who would never, as I told someone a couple of years ago, never have tolerated something like the Rodney King beating. This was not his idea of doing things. In those days, I have to put it the other way too, the blacks were generally afraid of the police, and traditionally for good reason. So there was rarely any violence. Most of the violence involved white rednecks.
Now, when you were that little boy watching the police arrest this man,
yes.
What was the? It's interesting to me. What was the image that you had of the police? Is it an image that they were your protectors, that they were people that you had to fear, that they were in conflict with your community?
My reaction at first, as near as I can recall, was simply it was another curiosity, things that happen in the world, and watching them take this person struggling. I didn't quite understand it. I'd never had a fight at that point. I didn't know anything about this. As far as my experiences in the police were concerned, I, as I said, did not ever intend to go into law enforcement as a career. But I did become increasingly alert to if sometimes the actuality, but certainly always the potential for police abuse of power. These are the days of the segregated South we're talking about, the last days of the segregated South.
If you were embarking on a career in criminology right now as a student, thinking about doing this, any advice?
I think that I would not want to get into a situation where I was constantly doing nothing but disembodied research, secondary analyses of NORC tapes, or this kind of thing, looking only at statistics. I want to be in a program where you get some hands-on learning. I think that programs, certainly of the future, should incorporate internships, should incorporate some first-hand experience in various ways in the criminal justice system to see how it does work and how it does look.
Starting with The Honest Politician, and then through a book called The Future of Imprisonment, 1974, the Madness in the Criminal Law, the early 1980s, The Brothel Boy later on, and others in between. There have been 2 or 3 subject areas that seem to have preoccupied you. One is prisons.
The other is mental
One
health.
is mental health, broadly defined.
Yes.
And the third is sentencing. The third seems to
And
be
I suppose
sentencing.
the defense of insanity is related to a couple of those. Yeah, but I've got over that problem.
Arguably within mental
Yeah,
health
but I
or
suppose the one
sentencing.
that's given me as much pleasure as anything is the future of imprisonment, which led to the creation of the program at Butner Federal Prison and to some influence, I think I can fairly say, on.
Now, what kind of a program is that, the program at Butner?
It's distinctive in a few ways. It was again chance that led to it being expressly adopted at this new federal institution. It's distinctive in that all programs other than work are voluntary and the program widely defined. The reasons for that are prudential. If you let the prisoners vote for programs with their feet, more will complete programs than if you don't. And it's an easier prison to run. And secondly, that prisoners subject to good behavior should know the date of their release. I think that it may be an aging process, but I have less confidence in quick changes, quick remedies, the hope for sudden growths of decency in the area where we both worked than I previously had. That doesn't mean that I don't think it's worth working for those values. I think they do in the end prove to be important. But I have got, like so many others in our field, rather depressed at the gap between legislative and public policy and the realities of the causes and treatment of crime.
Not quite uniquely among Western countries, but distinctively among Western countries, experience this large and growing gap between policy and knowledge and practitioners' best sense of what ought to be done about sentencing and corrections.
Well, let me amplify the question a wee bit because I find it hard to answer. One of the things that strikes me now is how far removed private conversations with judicial leadership, correctional leadership, police leadership is from what is publicly stated. You find more radical views of the inefficient role of the criminal justice system of this country amongst those leading people in police, courts, and corrections than you find anywhere. But they're very silent about it. The politics of democracy are very difficult indeed, and people are not good at standing up to the pressures. Their jobs often depend on it. I don't have quick answers to this at all. I think there is gradually a movement in this country to move away from the simple get tough on crime views. I think there are lots of straws in that wind. And I guess all I can say is I hope it blows harder. You know, there's not much else to say.
Once you chose to do graduate work at Wisconsin, what was your relationship with Marshall Clenard?
Well, he was tremendously instrumental in that. I mean, there's no
question about it, that I wouldn't be who I am, where I am, if it weren't for him. He was not just a teacher intellectually, he also became a kind of father figure to me. In a way, a replacement for the kinds of interests that my father had. I was able to talk to him about things that I had talked to my father about. And so consequently, I replaced Marshall, or I found in him, in a sense, an intellectual haven for some of the things that disturbed me.
Much of your work with Reckless dealt with studies of delinquency and self-concept,
right,
testing hypotheses that emerged out of the containment theory.
Right.
What was that containment theory, if you don't mind telling our audience? And are you satisfied with the way that work is remembered today?
Well, those are difficult questions. The containment theory essentially deals with the notion that there are things besides the socialization process that either propels or prevents individuals from getting involved in delinquent behavior. Walter had a good sense of the psychiatric literature at that time, and so he saw this, that there were personal factors that went beyond the neighborhood, beyond the school, and so forth. So containment essentially is a sort of summation, somewhat similar, by the way, to what Sutherland said, definitions of delinquency that are great over definitions that are not so great, to getting into trouble. And in this sense, what we're talking about is essentially the sum total of an individual's experiences and personal qualities that either propels or retards him from going in. Some of the pushes and pulls that he talked about are just of that kind. The internal containment was really what he focused on. How does one get to be internally contained in the face of these kinds of adversities? In answer to your question, I liked all of our research. I don't think we pushed it far enough. I would do it differently today if I had my choice, but I think it was really pretty good effort, considering we're talking about the 1950s, 60s, and so forth.
Later, Cy, you worked with John Conrad and others researching violence and the violent offender. What were the most meaningful findings of that research effort?
Remember, a little while ago, I talked about the fact that I moved from psychiatry over to this think tank called the Academy, which dealt with public policy issues. And one of the areas they were very interested in was obviously the area of criminology, and within that area, dangerous offenders. And so John Conrad, who had been the director of research in California, and then the director of research in the juvenile division of OJJDP, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, he and I teamed up. He had come to Columbus, and we teamed up and developed the Dangerous Offender Project. That project yielded 6 books and a variety of interests. You asked about the most important. Well, let me just mention that we were supported by the Lilly Endowment. We're very interested in dangerous offenders because of certain things that happened in Indianapolis. They had some dreadful events there, and so they decided to support it. And then the National Institute of Justice supported it to some extent. Now, we had different studies during that time. We began with a study on the history of dangerousness, the meaningfulness of dangerousness, what it meant in different epochs. And we had a historian, Isabel Rennie, who did that book for us on the dangerous offender in a historical context. She called it The Search for Criminal Man.
You've generally been pursuing what you refer to as a rational decision-making framework. Could you describe that a little bit? And then we'll talk about some of its critics.
Yes. I might have to quote from the book that you and I have together with those words in the subtitle. Generally, conceptualization is that decisions are made throughout the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system. In fact, decision-making gives one very useful way of viewing those systems for a lot of reasons. It's sort of, one could say that decision-making is the stuff of the criminal juvenile system. Yet we're making these decisions. Most people agree that those decisions ought to be rational, whatever that means. people have different ideas about what that means. There's no necessity that a decision be rational. You can't prove that it should be. But you may have a preference for a rational decision. If you look at what a rational decision is, one conceptualization is that it's that decision which selects the alternative that maximizes the likelihood of attainment of an objective that the decision maker has. When I came there to Rutgers, I thought, well, it's not a discipline. It's not a discipline of criminal justice. But I was always talking about it as a problem area. And we would have an interdisciplinary team examining a problem area. And I still think there's value to that model, but we do have more and more education now with graduate programs in criminal justice. And, you know, although I said there's no discipline like that, maybe that's wrong now. Even though it might have been right then, maybe there is a discipline in criminal justice. I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
Now, you recently retired from Rutgers.
Yes, I did.
And relocated in California.
Yes, I did.
Back to Sacramento, California.
Yes, I did.
Talk a little bit about what you're doing now.
Well, I've been working with some folks in Arizona. Recently did an evaluation of a program down there that's a statewide program defined by the legislature that it is a diversion program from the rest of the system. It has various treatment programs as components, and this was an empirical evaluation that using data that they've collected there in Arizona. So I just finished doing that. I have an NIJ grant.
Yet another grant.
Yet another grant.
These early predictors seem to be fairly stable throughout the life course.
That's right. I've read that in some of your books.
This is the 22nd of November, 1996. We're in the city of Chicago on the occasion of the American Side of Criminology meeting. There are four friends of one of the most remarkable figures in the history of criminology who have gathered here to commemorate him. This person was Franco Ferracuti.
Nathan Leopold was part of the Loeb-Leopold famous case that was often called the
crime of the century.
Crime of the century.
Like everything else.
Killing a little Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old.
Right. Marshall and I were, no, you certainly were around on the Midway in Chicago when the Leopold Loeb murder case occurred.
I spent about, an hour, maybe longer than that, with just Loeb and Leopold, and one other graduate student from our place. As you know, Leopold had one of the highest IQs recorded. He was extremely good at multiple factor analysis, etc., which was a big thing in those days. And we went out to talk to them because the graduate student of mine was working on some very difficult things. And as you know, Leopold did a lot of publication, not a lot, but several articles under the name Ferris Lawn in the field of prediction. Because, of course, prediction studies using a pseudonym while he was in prison.
They published that in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology.
Right. Yes. So we went out there. We spent about, I guess, an hour or two with them, just the two of them. Later, of course, Loeb was killed. And,
inside the prison.
In prison.
The reason I'm exploring this is, again, I want to shed light on Franco's personality. Why did he have a liking for Leopold? Why was there this sympathetic reaction? They both had killed a man or more than that in Franco's case. There was obviously an admiration and parallelity in intellect among the two.
I think Franco respected his intellect.
He was interested, essentially, in some of the same questions about the cultural patterns. One of the cultural patterns that excited him was the problem of delinquency. And one of the aspects of delinquency was the aggressive aspect of it. He was very interested in that sort of thing. Actually, he never left his biomedical base. Because the data that was collected had a very, very strong tinge of biomedical deal. For example, there were physical examinations on each and every one of the delinquents and non-delinquents down in Puerto Rico. There was, in addition, blood serum tests of all of them. There were parasite examinations and so forth. And in fact, some of those variables turned out to be fairly critical in the differentiation, as it turned out. So he was, in fact, a sociologist, but he and I talked a little bit more, apparently, than you and he talked about the psychiatric end of it, because I was in the Department of Psychiatry at the time doing research on schizophrenia. So that interested him, and we had a common denominator in the biomedical area.
Yeah.